Picture the very beginning of everything, before time, before light, before form itself existed, a formless void of darkness and water, and out of that nothingness comes the opening act of the book of Genesis, the foundational text shared across Judaism, Christianity, and Islam alike, a sweeping narrative that in just its first chapters manages to explain the origin of the universe, the fall of humanity, a catastrophic flood that reshapes the world, and the birth of the man who would become the Father of Nations. According to the text, God speaks the universe into existence across 6 days, first calling light into being and separating it from darkness, then forming the sky, gathering the waters to reveal dry land, filling the earth with plants and vegetation, setting the sun, moon, and stars into the heavens, populating the seas and skies with creatures, and finally filling the land with animals of every kind. And on the 6th day, in the culmination of this entire creative process, God forms the first human being, Adam, from the dust of the ground, breathing life into him, and places him in a lush paradise called the Garden of Eden, tasked with tending and caring for it. Seeing that Adam was alone, God declares it is not good for man to be without companionship, and after Adam names every creature brought before him without finding a suitable partner among them, God causes a deep sleep to fall upon him, takes one of his ribs, and forms from it the first woman, Eve, whom Adam recognizes immediately as bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh. And the two live together in the garden in a state of innocence and harmony, permitted to eat freely from every tree, except one, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which God warns will bring death upon the day they eat from it. Into this paradise comes a serpent, described as more crafty than any other creature God had made, who approaches Eve and subtly twists God's warning, questioning whether God had truly forbidden all the trees and suggesting that eating from the forbidden tree would not bring death at all, but would instead open their eyes and make them like God, knowing good and evil. Eve, seeing that the fruit looked good for food, pleasing to the eye, and desirable for the wisdom it promised, took and ate it, and gave some to Adam as well, who ate without objection, and in that instant, the text tells us, their eyes were opened, and their first realization was not divine wisdom but shame, as they suddenly became aware of their own nakedness and hurried to cover themselves with fig leaves. When God came walking through the garden that evening, Adam and Eve hid from him in fear, and under questioning, Adam blamed Eve, while Eve in turn blamed the serpent. But responsibility could not be deflected so easily, and God pronounced consequences upon each of them in turn. The serpent was cursed to crawl upon its belly and live in enmity with humankind forever. Eve was told that childbirth would now bring great pain and that her relationship with Adam would be marked by struggle, and Adam was told that the ground itself was now cursed because of him, that he would have to labor painfully for his food through sweat and toil for the rest of his life, until he returned to the very dust from which he had been formed. Adam and Eve were then expelled from the Garden of Eden entirely, with cherubim and a flaming sword placed at its entrance to prevent their return, and it is here, outside paradise, that human history as the text presents it truly begins, a history that quickly reveals the growing consequences of this first act of disobedience. Adam and Eve's 2 sons, Cain and Abel, each brought offerings to God, Cain from his harvest as a farmer and Abel from the firstborn of his flock as a shepherd, and when God favored Abel's offering over Cain's, Cain grew consumed with jealousy and rage, and despite God's direct warning to master the sin crouching at his door, Cain lured his brother into a field and killed him, becoming the first murderer in human history and introducing violence into the world his parents had already marked with disobedience. As generations multiplied across the earth, the text describes humanity's wickedness growing so great and so pervasive that God, grieved in his heart over what he had made, resolved to send a great flood to wipe the corrupted earth clean and begin again, sparing only one righteous man, Noah, described as blameless among the people of his time, who walked faithfully with God even as the world around him descended into violence and moral collapse. God instructed Noah to build an enormous vessel, an ark, built of gopher wood and coated with pitch, with precise dimensions and a structure of multiple decks, and to bring aboard his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives, along with a male and female of every kind of land animal, and 7 pairs of every clean animal, to preserve life through the coming catastrophe. When the ark was complete and the animals gathered, the rains began, and the text describes both the sky opening and the great subterranean waters bursting forth, flooding the entire earth for 40 days and 40 nights until even the highest mountains were submerged, wiping out every living creature outside the ark, while Noah and his family, along with the animals sheltered within, rode out the flood safely upon the rising waters. After the rain stopped, the waters took months to recede, and Noah famously sent out a raven and then a dove to test whether dry land had reappeared, the dove finally returning with a freshly plucked olive leaf, a sign of hope that has echoed through art and culture for millennia as a symbol of peace, and eventually the ark came to rest upon the mountains of Ararat, allowing Noah, his family, and every animal aboard to step out onto dry land once again. In gratitude, Noah built an altar and offered a sacrifice, and God responded with a covenant, promising never again to destroy the earth with a flood, and setting a rainbow in the clouds as an everlasting sign of that promise, a pledge that would echo through the rest of the biblical narrative as an early symbol of divine mercy following judgment. Genesis then briefly turns to the more mysterious and debated passages describing the Nephilim, a term the text applies to beings born from a union between the sons of God and human women in the years before the flood, described as the mighty men of old, men of renown, a passage that has generated centuries of theological debate over interpretation, with some traditions understanding the sons of God as fallen angelic beings and others interpreting the phrase as referring to human lines of noble or godly descent. And this ambiguous and much discussed passage is often cited as part of the broader moral corruption that led God to send the flood in the first place. As Noah's descendants multiplied and spread across the earth following the flood, they settled together on a plain in the land of Shinar and, in a display of collective pride, resolved to build a great city with a tower reaching to the heavens, determined to make a name for themselves and avoid being scattered across the earth. But God, observing their unified ambition, confused their single language into many different tongues so that they could no longer understand one another, scattering them across the face of the earth exactly as they had feared, and the site of this unfinished tower became known as Babel, a story often understood as explaining the origin of the world's diverse languages and nations. From this scattered post-flood world, Genesis narrows its focus onto a single family line, tracing the descendants of Noah's son Shem down through the generations until arriving at a man named Abram, living in the city of Ur, whom God called to leave his homeland, his relatives, and his father's household entirely, promising to make of him a great nation, to bless him, to make his name great, and, most significantly, that all the families of the earth would ultimately be blessed through him. Abram obeyed, setting out with his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and his household toward a land God promised to show him, eventually settling in the land of Canaan, and across the following chapters, God repeatedly renewed and expanded this covenant, promising Abram descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore, despite Abram and Sarai's advancing age and Sarai's inability to bear children for decades. It was during this covenant renewal that God changed Abram's name to Abraham, meaning father of many nations, and Sarai's name to Sarah, sealing the covenant with the practice of circumcision as its physical sign among Abraham's descendants, and eventually, in fulfillment of the long-delayed promise, Sarah gave birth to a son, Isaac, in her old age, precisely as God had promised. Abraham's faith was tested most dramatically when God instructed him to sacrifice Isaac, his long-awaited son, upon a mountain in the region of Moriah, and Abraham, in an act of profound and often debated obedience, prepared to carry out the command, binding Isaac upon an altar, only to be stopped at the final moment by an angel of the Lord, who provided a ram caught in a nearby thicket as a substitute offering, a moment that has been interpreted across religious traditions as the ultimate demonstration of Abraham's faith and trust in God, and which is honored similarly in the Quran's account of Ibrahim's willingness to sacrifice his son. Genesis continues to follow Abraham's family line through Isaac, his son Jacob, later renamed Israel, and Jacob's 12 sons, whose descendants would become the 12 tribes of Israel, closing its narrative arc with the story of Joseph, one of Jacob's youngest sons, who was sold into slavery in Egypt by his own jealous brothers, only to rise through hardship and unjust imprisonment to become the second most powerful man in Egypt, ultimately reuniting with and forgiving the very brothers who had betrayed him during a devastating famine that brought his entire family to settle in Egypt, setting the stage for the story of Exodus that would follow generations later. Looking back across the entire sweep of Genesis today, from creation itself to a family reunited in Egypt, what emerges is a text less concerned with a single continuous storyline than with a series of profound and recurring themes: the tension between divine blessing and human disobedience, The persistence of God's covenant despite repeated human failure, and the quiet but consistent thread of mercy running alongside every act of judgment, whether in the sparing of Noah, the rescue of Isaac, or the eventual reconciliation between Joseph and his brothers. It is precisely this combination of cosmic scope and deeply personal family drama that has allowed Genesis to endure for thousands of years as one of the most influential texts in human history, shaping not only the religious beliefs of billions across Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but also countless works of art, literature, and moral reflection. Its opening chapters still asked and debated today just as they were in ancient times. Where did we come from? Why does suffering exist alongside beauty? And what does it mean to walk faithfully through a broken world in search of a promise not yet fully seen?